Hi, everyone. It's Melissa Reeves with Melanin Stories Matter, and we are on our video interview and podcast episode number 2. And it brings me great joy to have Kristina Diaz with us today. Hi, Kristina. Hi, yeah, we can see you and we're going to hear you. She has been a powerful force in helping Melanin Stories Matter come to its own being. And from the very, very beginning, in fact, you were our very first storyteller in our very first show with Caramel Mocha Frappuccino. Do you want to tell a little bit about the story that you told? Because I absolutely loved it. And we're going to put a link to this story so that the listeners can see it and hear it.
Absolutely. Well, our first show was about um, the introduction of racism into our lives, more or less. Like where were those um, spaces in the everyday that we experienced it, and it was interesting because I had to think about what that meant and where I'd seen it, and once you start paying attention, it became like a rabbit hole where you're just spiraling. You're like here and here and here and here, um, and you don't realize how much it affects your life until you pay attention to it. Um, uh, One of our other storytellers from that show, Harjus, I loved what he said. He's like, if you are constantly paying attention to all these little things, it might break you, and so you kind of push it to the side and move forward. Um, but
As if
like
it's
another,
like I'm sorry, I was going to say it's like a survival skill in a sense because there can be so many moments of like microaggressions that can be coming at you
Mhm.
that if you pay attention to all of them, it's like the thousand cuts that can cause all of the bleeding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and also so the interesting thing is like living in the Caribbean, especially the microcosm that is Puerto Rico. Um, there is there are a lot of layers tied into identity, and so people here will first identify as Puerto Rican, and
Mhm.
rather than identifying as a color or a race. Um, there's this national identity that trumps everything else, you know.
Mhm.
um, and a lot of it has to do with how history is taught here in Puerto Rico, and the things that they want the population as a whole to forget, I guess. um,
What do you mean by that?
so when I was in school,
Mhm.
uh, they teach you. So in the beginning, there were the Taino peoples, who were the First Nations of Puerto Rico. And then came Christopher Columbus. And the second island that he came upon was Puerto Rico. And then the Spaniards came and colonized. And they killed so many of the natives that they had to bring in slaves to do the work because um, they couldn't, the population was dying. And then uh, fast forward uh, from the 1400s to the 1800s, we're trying to be independent, but then we get swapped as like spoils of war to the US. And then we're in the present time. So there are a lot of gaps in the storytelling. And it's
Mhm.
just poor, like if it were just a story living by itself, it's a bad story because you miss so many of the important things in between. And
Mhm.
I would bet that a lot of people don't know like a lot of the contemporary history, um, and it's done on purpose so that people don't think about how we got to where we are, because if they did, they would feel very differently about how they vote, how they what they want in terms of status. And here, status is this idea uh, of the status has to do with our relationship with the U.S. So, do we become an independent nation? Do we advocate to become a state? Do we advocate to become um, a free associated state with sovereignty? You know, like the Minor Antilles and the British Empire, like they're their own countries, but uh, because they're associated and free, they are still under the protection of the British military. And if they have to go to the war, they have that agreement. You know, like there are pros and cons and layers to that relationship, but they have the option to um, do commerce in a way that benefits them as a country and so on. We don't have that right now. In many ways, we're like Washington D.C.,
Hmm.
where we have a voice but no vote. And uh, but I think, like most, if not all, the territories, which are the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and Puerto Rico,
Right.
um, because there's that physical disconnect because we're island nations. Um, we're not thought of often. We're a second thought. But
Hmm.
again, I'm going down the rabbit hole. um,
Right, right, right. But I mean, it's important because I think you're right. You said something earlier. You're like, I don't think a lot of people know. No, they don't. I mean, growing up in the Midwest, I was taught very little about Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands or Guam, even very little. And anything in my history book that was told to me, I believed. Christopher Columbus, great guy. No, he wasn't. He wasn't at all. And so in this show, there has been so much education that, especially I think, white audiences have been ignorant to, and you can say, well, they didn't mean to, but I personally have been like finding myself shocked at what I don't know. And then when I start to get enlightened by it, you're right, people start to change on how they perceive and think about, our our family of islanders. I mean, what would you like to see? Would you like to see Puerto Rico be a state?
no,
No.
no,
Okay.
not. I don't think it benefits us at all to become
Okay.
a state. I've seen how the U.S. treats its poorer or states, like Michigan. I've visited. I've visited the poorest town in the United States, which is this town in California, and I'm blanking on the name right now.
Where
Um,
is it? I from there.
it's a town in California, and it's the
Hmm.
poorest town in the whole country, like the whole continental U.S. Um, and I got to visit, and I've just seen how the politics work. I
Hmm.
also feel like there's so here's a tidbit. Um, it comes down to identity. Like for a long time, um, Puerto Rico was not allowed to elect a local governor until the 1950s. Before
Wow.
then, they were either United States appointed or Spanish rule appointed.
Hmm.
So that's not a long time. It's
No,
150
that's not a
years that
long.
we've been able to choose our own people. At one point in our history, it was illegal for us to have our a flag. We had to
It
fly
was illegal.
the illegal. You were fined or had penalties and the like for having a Puerto Rican flag. Um, and so we had to fight to have the right to have our own flag. Um, that's why if you come across Puerto Ricans, whether they realize it or not, that sense of pride, like I'm waving my flag, comes from the fact that for a long
Yeah.
time we were not allowed to.
Yeah, you fought for it so hard. Wow.
And so we have representation in the Olympics. We have representation in Miss Universe. We have international representation in hundreds, if not thousands, of different competitions and contests, from mathematics to sports, and everything in between. And we try to be proud of that. And I know that if, like, we become a state, we lose that.
Ah,
We lose that. We will no longer be able to represent Puerto Rico. We have to represent the US. And there is
right.
no doing both. Like, statehood means you give up. When people who are immigrants come to the United States and apply for citizenship, part of the oath that they proclaim is renouncing their old citizenship and their country, and committing to the United States of America. It's like, if you read the language in there, it's a little heartbreaking, but you do it. Whoever does it, they do it because it's a choice that they have made. There's nothing wrong
Hmm.
with that.
Hmm.
But just knowing the people here, I know that that would not be a good thing for us as a country,
Right.
to lose that sense of identity. Um, Even with language, like, in Puerto Rico, we speak Spanish, and that's the national language. But because we were invaded by the US and became a territory of the US, now everything has to be in English and Spanish, all official documents. And I've read stories of like that transition time, and the attempt to, um, like, I don't know. I don't have words for it, but but
Yeah, that's
that's
okay.
why my so coming back to my story, like, it, there is
Mm-hmm.
this national generational trauma that exists, and
Mm-hmm.
if we don't have to think about um, the things that have happened in our recent history, then we can live in bliss, I guess, and not have to worry about things. But as I was having a conversation with my husband the other day, he's got hazel eyes and he's light skinned, and he's like, but I'm if anything mixed. He's like, I've got black people in my family. I'm like, sweetie, but you're not black. I love you,
Yeah,
but
right.
you're not dark like me, no matter
It's
how
white
mixed you
passing.
think you are.
Yeah.
Um, so
Well, that was the beauty in your story was how you described your family and you used food terms like your grandmother, or was it your mother's cream of wheat,
mhm.
and your father was, or your grandfather was dark chocolate, and you were caramel frappuccino. Mocha, what was it? Caramel mocha frappuccino was the
Mhm.
name of your story. It was really, really beautiful. And you threaded that so nicely throughout the whole story. Um, but you really got us in three different stories of moments that your melanin um, was was judged. The Chihuahua story, where your cousins were walking in DC, and I remember you were saying that they were terrified of your Chihuahuas, right, when they came to visit you,
Yeah, mhm. And these were my
because
mom's cousins, like, uh, but it is, and theirs is an interesting experience as well, because when they came, so you look at them and they look black, African American black, but
hmm
they're half Latino, and you can tell that in their names. But when they came to Puerto Rico and met the rest of the family, they were shocked that there were members of the family that were white. And they're like,
hmm
how is this even possible? That doesn't make any sense. But
well,
historically in Puerto Rico, and I think what a lot of people don't understand is, yes, Latinos and Hispanic people are people of color, but
Mm-hmm.
within each country there are shades.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, there are Black Puerto Ricans, there are brown Puerto Ricans, there are white Puerto Ricans. And we had this whole caste system that was outlined by the Spanish Empire, dividing people according to how they were mixed. And
Well,
mhm.
you said in your story, I'm just looking at my notes, where you were told growing up to marry, what was it, to marry the light to
Marry,
improve the
yeah,
race?
yep, marry light to improve the race or the culture.
So
And
a fair-skinned Puerto Rican would be a desirable partner to a darker-skinned Puerto Rican. So that's what you were taught.
well, that's a saying that exists. It's not something necessarily I was taught. Not in my family, but just things
Okay.
you hear on the street. Um,
Okay.
and that's not why I married Elvin.
But how did that make you feel hearing something like that as you were growing up? And
I don't like, again, it's not something I really understood until I was older.
Mhm.
Um, when maybe like middle school, when you start having crushes and people look at you and they think you're ugly. Um, and and you're like trying to figure out like why that is. And um, but I remember at one point when I was in college, like after, as you grow you process things a little bit more, and I had a
Mhm.
conversation with my great grandmother, and she is also white, and her first husband, my grandmother's father, was Indian,
Mhm.
like me. um,
Mhm.
but I didn't know that until I was older. And so I remember having a conversation with her and saying, "Hey, Grandma, you know, tell me about your first husband. Like, what was he like?" And she told me, and she said he was just like you, beautiful and brown. And I said, "Is that why you love me? Because I'm brown like him?" And she's
Mm.
like, "Yes." And having that conversation
Mm.
made a world of difference,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
she came from a generation where that wasn't necessarily the case. And
Yeah.
and so I mean I treasure that moment, and um and knew that it didn't matter what color I was, that the people who love me really love me for me.
Right.
um but it's
What?
interesting because presently there is this big debate, like, as I said earlier, people get offended when you say I'm Afro Puerto Rican, and they're like, "Oh, so now you're too good to be Puerto Rican, that you can't just be Puerto Rican, you have to be Afro Puerto Rican."
Oh.
And to that I say, yes, mi amor, estamos grabando.
Busy lives.
I I've said yes, it's okay to be both, because um, Puerto Rican doesn't have to be one thing. Like, uh, we do have Black people, we do have Native people.
Mhm.
We might not have our culture as Native people. We might not be recognized by any government, but historically, like, the Native peoples were just only disappeared because they stopped counting them in the census.
Oh, wow. Wow. So Afro Puerto Rican, you're finding comfort in that identity.
Well, I identify more as Tainas, which is Native.
Okay. All right. Are there other groups that are also like, so if let's say someone's more fair, like me, I could be Puerto Rican, right? I could be of the Scottish descent. Wasn't that true when you taught me?
Well, you could be Puerto Rican, but you wouldn't be Scottish descent. You would be I mean, there are redheaded Puerto Ricans who are very fair,
Yeah.
um, and they get teased and called Casper the Friendly Ghost. But
Yeah.
but they exist, and um, so color really isn't a marker here. It's
Hmm.
language and culture.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but uh, so originally, there were the Spaniards, and their children born here were criollos. And then everyone else who was mixed fell into that caste system. So you have mulatto, which is a word you might be familiar with, mestizo, which
Yes.
is, so mulatto is black and white, mestizo is Indian and white, Zambo is black and Indian or native. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and then there, like, there's so many, like, they wouldn't let you just be one thing. Like, they were really nitpicking. Like, if a mestizo married a mulatto, they were something else, you know. And you can Google the caste
Yeah.
part. Like, I've seen like the Mexican version of it,
Hmm.
um, and it's just long. It's poster size. I'm just like,
Right.
wow.
Right. Well, kind of like our pronoun list, right? It's like we're just finding ways that people identify and we're adding to it. That would be a very interesting link to post on that for us to see
Yeah.
the variety.
I wouldn't say it's the same as pronouns because these are identities that are being placed upon and not chosen.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Good consciousness. Let's talk about an upcoming show that you're going to help co-host, and I'm super excited by this. We're taking on a topic in the next Melanin Matters show, which is on April 24th. We have an incredible array of storytellers unpacking a word or a phrase that is environmental racism.
Yes.
So, yeah, how are you feeling about us taking that topic on?
I am excited because this is a subject that affects a lot of people,
Hmm.
but it is people don't necessarily realize it. You know, the impact of how where you live and who you are determines what you have access to and
Hmm.
the help you receive.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, no, and we've got some
some
stories that are just really powerful. Like you have actually brought forward some of the talent that will be sharing stories. Pastor Arroyo, when he's talking about the cities that have their marketing face, and then the face of really what it's like to live there in the neighborhoods and how it's not really aligned. And he goes into three different areas. But he's got a beautiful, beautiful connection to his grandmother. So I'm so excited, so grateful that you brought him forward. I think he's going to be quite a shining star in his story and his message that we need to pay attention to. And then another person that you brought forward who's going to share what it's like to live through a hurricane. Bad ones. Marie and Irma, you've
mhm.
lived through a few. How's that
I
been?
lived through both of those.
Yeah. Yeah. And then so you were saying before we started that sometimes they're just like really bad thunderstorms and you play Scrabble and they go away the next day.
Yeah,
But
like normal hurricanes are not like Irma or Maria. Like those are
right.
category 5, and these are effects of climate change because hurricanes occur when the earth has hot flashes, you know? Uh,
I'm glad
when
I'm not
when
alone.
when your temperature rises, you look for ways to cool yourself, and that's what a hurricane does. It drops the temperature so that things can cool down. The hotter it becomes, the bigger the hurricane. So climate change is a real factor in that. And when
Hmm.
I remember hurricanes when I was little, like it was like, okay, we know it's coming. And yes, there was destruction. Things, some people's houses did fall over, but for the most part, you just stayed home. You had snacks. You played games until the power went out, and then you went to sleep. And then the next
Hmm.
day it had passed, and you waited to see like what had happened, and maybe it took a week or two to get power back.
A
Oh,
week or
and
two, or
mhm,
two.
to get
Think
power
about that,
and
listeners. 2 weeks without power. We freak out in 3 days here in Seattle. I mean, we're like,
and
oh, what is this? Two
I mean,
weeks.
of course, like it all depends because like I know there are some areas near, especially near where I live, where it rains and it floods, and I'm sure it was a very different experience for that community. But at least in the more in the city in San Juan where I lived growing up, that was my experience with hurricanes. So I don't want to
Hmm.
say it's always fun. I'm just saying it wasn't as devastating. Um,
Right,
and in the Virgin Islands, it's a completely different story because they have a completely different infrastructure.
right,
Um, Whereas we have rivers here in Puerto Rico to so that we have water system. Most of the homes in the VI are cistern based because they have no rivers, and so
right.
that has a really big impact on
Yes,
how things recover after a hurricane.
yes, and this storyteller Arlene is in the Virgin Islands when she first is going through because she got hit by two. She said Irma blew the roof off, and Marie um, soaked everything. Do you remember it like that? The winds and then the rain from the second one.
Well, the funny thing is, Irma came and it missed us and hit them. So everything we had stockpiled to recover from Irma, we were sending to the VI. And then all of a sudden, Maria came and everything fell apart. And like, oh no, but we gave all our stuff away. And some people were like joking, maybe we can ask for it back. And we're like, no, we can't. We still need to help them. But how do we help ourselves? And it's just
Right,
like, oh my goodness.
right. That is ironic. That is ironic. Well, I think that the subject matter and it we can unpack it in a few ways too, because there's environmental racism within the workforce, right? We're seeing that we have a storyteller that is going to talk about that in his neighborhood and what it was like growing up Asian, and the way the treatment of his family was in an all-white neighborhood, and then how it's still cranking in the work world, and then aggression, and that is an environment, and so we really want to like kind of explore a variety of ways of how environmental racism plays into our world so that we can
Yeah.
wake up
We're
and
expanding beyond the original definition, which is basically that you are denied certain benefits based on where you live and because of your race.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
Examples are like Flint, Michigan, who don't
Yep.
have clean water still, and how most impoverished communities are right next to uh, like plants and um,
Hmm.
factories and buildings where the runoff affects their
Oh,
water, and the breathing quality of the air is just terrible.
right. Well, we have a storyteller that's going to share that there's arsenic in the water in Hopi Nation and what he's done to try to rectify that. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely clearly good examples of environmental racism. And the fact that
Mhm.
Flint is still claiming and dealing with it after all this time is just ridiculous. Um, so yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think you're going to be a wonderful, wonderful co-host, and I thank you so much. You're on our advisory board, and I really appreciate that personally, because you have so much smart insights and ideas for our shows, especially as we're looking at 2022. Can you believe that we're already planning on subjects for 2022? And there's a lot. We could dedicate shows on just one thing and just go with it. So In fact, environmental racism may make an appearance again, right? Like we were doing it in April, right around Earth Day. It could be an ongoing show that we do at this time of year.
And
But
I would
yeah,
like to encourage anyone who's watching or listening to this that if you do have a story and you think, well, none of the themes fit, to send the idea anyway, because we are hoping to eventually do smaller versions of stories that are in between shows,
yep,
because your story matters, and it
yeah,
doesn't have to fit a theme for it to matter. Um, we'd still love to hear it. We'd still love to hear from you, and
hmm,
maybe it can help us inspire a theme for future events because we don't know everything. We're always learning,
yeah.
and we need those ideas and thoughts, and there is room for you too, even if you have a story that doesn't relate to a theme. So I just want to
Definitely.
let people know
Yeah.
that.
Yep. So it's Melanin Stories Matter. There's a link that just says tell us your story, and then we'll be able to get a synopsis and even give you a call and explore it. So thank you. That's really important. So there's a lot of things that we want to do for this platform to continue amplifying the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color because these stories need to be heard. They need to be heard. They open up hearts. And I personally, my journey with working with you and Brianna and all of the cast members in our last, let's see, how many shows have we done? 5? We've done 5 shows since September. We did September, October, November, and then I did January with Rise Up for the Martin Luther King, and then we did Black Lives Living, and now we are on our 6th show, which is in April. We have a June 19th, Juneteenth show, which is another Rise Up version where we use original music to go with the stories, which is really pretty powerful. And then we have Growing Up BIPOC in August. So think about that, how you grew up, what was your family like, what were some of the issues that you dealt with. And then we will close out 2021 with Indigenous Honor in October. And we chose October because that is Indigenous Peoples Day typically, but it's also a time that we learn from Donna Christian, who's also on our board, that, and again, didn't know, but the pain for Indigenous people starts in October when football season's in gear and there's mascots that have Indian heads or tomahawks and it's insulting. And then we learn, what does she call it? Pokahati as a costume for Halloween. No, it doesn't work. And then you go into Thanksgiving, which is an entire breadth of pain. So we're hoping that we can bring forth and show also the beauty of all of our storytellers and their cultures because you are beautiful. And I am just grateful. I'm just so grateful to be working on this with you and everyone. Thank you for sharing all you do.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to wrap. So thank you again, Kristina Diaz. This was episode 2 of Melanin Stories Matter, the podcast and interview series. And so we will see you again, your beautiful face on our show on April 24th. So just stay tuned with us. If you want to keep getting information, go ahead and sign up for our newsletter and we will keep you posted on the events that we're doing. And again, tell us your story. And also, if you're an organization that we should know about, we do raise a lot of money within our shows too. So that's really important that we highlight organizations that are supporting the voices of the audiences that we are amplifying. Okay? So thank you.
All right.
All right. Where are we?